The last theme to be examined from our evolutionary perspective is old versus new foods. Think of the foods we find today in any grocery store. How many of them do you think our ancestor, the caveman, would recognize? The answer is close to zero. But without getting that far back, how many do you think your grandmother's grandmother would recognize? Only a small percent. Mostly the fresh produce and the minimally processed food that we find along the perimeter of the store. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors ate mostly fruits, vegetables, and roots, the gathering part of their name, and then game meat or fish that they hunted. They didn't eat grains and legumes because they had no way of processing them. They would maybe occasionally steal some eggs, but certainly they didn't eat milk because you cannot really milk a wild animal. The agricultural revolution, with the possibility of growing plants and domesticating animals, along with some technological advances, introduced new foods, and in particular cereals, and so flour and bread, then legumes and other animal sources of proteins, in particular milk and dairy, and the more regular consumption of eggs. Yet, up until the Industrial Revolution, only a few generations ago, processed food was mostly unknown. Most food additives were never used before. Canned food or highly processed food did not exist. How about sugar? For most of human history, the only source of concentrated sugar was a little honey, but only seasonally and then again not very easy to steal it from a beehive without proper equipment. Sugar as we know it, in the form of crystalline sucrose, did not exist until 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, when the Indians developed a method to turn sugarcane juice into granulated crystals. But even then it was scarce and expensive, especially in Europe where it came through the spice trade and was considered a luxury. Ancient Greeks and Romans made virtually no use of sugar. In the 15th century England, using sugar in place of honey as a sweetener was considered extremely posh, but the privilege of only a few. And yet some far-sighted doctors already back then very sharply observed that there was a link between high sugar consumption and the development of diabetes. Brilliant observations that were unfortunately lost in history and didn't come back to mainstream science until very recently, as we will extensively discuss later in this course. Anyway, it wasn't until the beginning of the 19th century that sugar became widely available thanks to agricultural and technological progress. First of all, the development by French botanist Benjamin Delcerre of a procedure to extract sugar from sugar beet. What used to be a scarce and expensive food soon became cheap and widely available. Towards the end of the 19th century, nutrition physiology studies on the role of sugar as energetic fuel for our body contributed to completely rehabilitate sugar in the eyes of consumers. Sugar was widely advertised as the ideal food for everyone who wishes to fuel up, from children to athletes. For the food industry, sugar soon became the magic ingredient. It is very cheap, incredibly versatile, and everyone likes its taste. And so here we are in recent history, when sugar consumption skyrocketed. At the beginning of the 18th century, average sugar consumption was less than 2 kilograms per person per year. And at the beginning of the 19th century, it had raised to about 6 to 8 kilograms of sugar per person per year. Today, sugar consumption is 60 to 70 kilograms per person per year on average. That's a tenfold increase in little more than 3 centuries. The consequence of this sugar crave is under everybody's eyes, a pandemic of obesity and diabetes. Although the scientific community nowadays is very well aware of the dangers of an excessive consumption of sugar, for a large part of the food industry, sugar still remains that magic ingredient that is very cheap, very addictive, and can be used everywhere. Which is why it's still everywhere in our food chain, so much so that some observers suspect some sort of sugar conspiracy, particularly after 1986 when the United States Food and Drug Administration, in part under the pressures of food industry lobbies, and in part not to undermine the governmental guidelines that for years had placed carbs at the basis of every dietary recommendation, officially stated that sugar presents no risk to health at the current levels of consumption, with the only exception of dental cavities. Alas, we now know very well that the FDA got this one dead wrong. Later in this course, when we study the carbohydrates, you will better understand why excessive sugar consumption is indeed extremely detrimental to our health. So far we have discussed how new foods recently made their way into our food chain. But let's look for a moment at the old ones. We said that for well over 99% of human history, men ate primarily fruits, vegetables, game meat, and fish. These are the old foods, the ones that our genes are supposedly more adapted to. But are these foods nowadays still the same as our ancestors used to eat? The answer is no. These foods too are in large part different. Game meat, or meat from wild animals in general, is lean with little external fat and no marbling. Feedlot animals, who eat and don't move, are way fatter with visible marbling and more saturated fat. Because of these and the stressful living conditions, their health is far from optimal. They are insulin resistant and more prone to disease and infection, requiring frequent use of antibiotics. Free-range animals are somewhere in between, but most of the meat on our grocery store shelves comes from feedlot animals. Let's talk feeding practices. Pasture-fed animals have a meat that's lower in calories and higher in its omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, an attribute which we will fully appreciate when we study lipids. Virtually all cattle in the US until 1850 was free-range, grass-fed. But today the vast majority of farm-raised animals are not raised on grass, but on corn or grain. You can easily spot the difference on the supermarket shelf. Pasture-fed meat fat is orange to dark yellow in color. Grain-fed is white. Compared to pasture-fed animals, grain-fed animals have a meat that has more calories, more saturated fat, more omega-6 coming from the cereals, and less omega-3 coming from the grass. Now about fish. It had a very similar fate. Aquaculture fish is often raised on omega-6 rich oils, so it doesn't really have a lot of those good omega-3 fat that wild fish has. Some of the cheapest fish, such as tilapia or farmed catfish, have actually most of the times very bad omega-6 to omega-3 ratios. On top of that, contamination of oceans, rivers, and lakes has introduced toxic substances in the food chain such as mercury and other heavy metals, PCBs, pesticides, and many others. These contaminants easily bioaccumulate, especially in freshwater fish from rivers and lakes in industrialized polluted areas, and in larger, longer-lived predatory fish that populate the oceans. And lastly, let's have a look at fruits and vegetables. Since the introduction of agriculture, men have actively practiced genetical engineering by means of selection and crossbreeding to create entirely new varieties of the fruits and vegetables. This big, juicy, sweet apple did not exist 10,000 years ago. Apples were smaller, way more astringent, less sweet, and less juicy. This tomato also doesn't resemble anything that existed 10,000 years ago. And the same goes for almost every fruit and vegetable that we eat today. They are the result of hundreds of years of active selection and careful plant breeding to create bigger and juicier edible plants. As a result of these, however, today's fruit has a lot more sugar and a lot less of those bioactive compounds such as polyphenols that we have recently rediscovered as extremely precious health-promoting substances. Plants grown with modern agricultural practices do not have to struggle for water and nutrients or to protect themselves from extreme weather or pests. They are spoiled and cuddled with all sorts of agrochemicals in greenhouses, protected from insects, from light, from cold. So they too, just like us, don't need to activate any adaptive stress response. This also results in a lower production of those health-promoting bioactives, such as polyphenols, that plants normally produce to protect themselves from cold, light, microbes, and insects. So to recap, our genes are not very well adapted to modern times because evolution is slow, while our world, our environment, our lifestyle, and our habits have changed dramatically in a short period of time, evolutionarily speaking. Our genes are still designed to deal with food scarcity rather than abundance, with a very active lifestyle instead of a sedentary one, and with consumption of foods and nutrients that are a lot different than what we actually find today in our grocery stores. But make no mistake, this is not to say that we should go back and feed ourselves like our ancestor the caveman did, although someone actually suggests we should. What our genes are really unprepared for is the new dietary patterns, not so much the new foods. Before it enters our bloodstream, foodstuff is broken down to its single nutrients, and once these are absorbed, our body doesn't really care where they come from. An amino acid is an amino acid. It doesn't matter whether it comes from pasta or a chicken breast. Once it's inside our body, it's the very same molecule. So the real trick is not to eat like the caveman and fear all the new and different foods, but rather choosing all the new foods in the right proportions so that the overall nutrient composition of our diet is as close as possible to what our genes are designed for.